Hello, my name is Chris Snipes, and you are listening to The Melt. Spirit photography is the practice of photographing seances and mediums, and began in the late 1800s and became more widespread with the popularization of the then prevalent Spiritualist movement that was fast gaining notoriety around the same time. Spiritualism was an American movement turned religion that posited that the spirits of one's dead loved ones could indeed be contacted and communicated with, and that this could serve both as a source of comfort and as proof that there was an afterlife. As these seances and sitting circles became more popular, so did the practice of physical mediumship. And concurrently, the means to take photographs were being invented and perfected, and spiritualism and photography became intertwined in a very fascinating way. With the resurgence of seances and sitting circles, there now has been a resurgence of the photography of such things, thanks to today's guest, Shannon Taggart. In November, she will be releasing the book Séance, Spiritualist Ritual, and the Search for Ectoplasm, which will be a 300-page book containing many of the photographs that she has taken over the past almost 2 decades, and will also include essays on spiritualism and seek to document some of the history of spiritualism. I begin the interview by asking Shannon how she first got into photography.
I was drawn to photography through a high school photography class, and it was specifically the work of Deanne Arbus.
Oh, yeah.
That brought me into photography. And around the same time of my life, my family had this strange experience with the spiritualist medium where we learned details about my grandfather's death that proved to be true. But I didn't put them together in my mind at that time. That came much later, but I encountered them both around the same time.
And where did you get this reading at?
My cousin traveled to Lilydale, New York, which is the world's largest spiritualist community. I grew up nearby in Buffalo, New York, and my family is actually a lot of my mother's family is from the southern tier of New York State. That's what you would call that area, like the southern tier. It's Lilydale's halfway in between Erie, Pennsylvania, and Buffalo, New York. So in that area, and that's where I encountered it. So I just happened to grow up near the world's largest spiritualist community,
which I never knew existed until I came across an interview. When you mentioned that, what do you know the origins of how that coalesced? Like, how did these people all get together in the same place?
Well, at the turn of the century, Buffalo was actually like the richest city in the country because of the ports and the Erie Canal and the Great Lakes and Niagara Falls. It was one of the first cities to have electricity. It was and Rochester, New York also was a posh city at that time. And spiritualism erupted outside of Rochester, and Lilydale, the land was donated, but it was at the end of a train. At the time, there was a train that stopped there, and it's, a nice little plot of land right on a beautiful lake. So it kind of became a getaway spot. And that's sort of how it evolved.
Uh-huh. So did Lilydale come before spiritualism, or did spiritualism happen and then Lily Dale kind of followed?
It's actually a strange story because the founders of Lilydale were loosely organized in 1844, and they were doing mesmeric healing. Like they were using mesmerism, which is this idea that there's energy force that permeates everything, and that you can manipulate it through magnetic passes. Started by hypnosis, started by the physician Mesmer. But so they were playing around with mesmeric healing in 1844, and the spiritualism didn't erupt until 1848, so it kind of preceded it. But many people say that when spiritualism actually erupted, all the parts were already moving in place in order for it to erupt, and mesmerism was definitely one of those moving parts.
And the spiritualist movement itself originated with the experiences of the Fox sisters?
Yeah, well, that's when it became a movement that spread. Um, but I mean, there's always been, in every culture throughout history, the practice has existed just under different names or traditions, or you know spiritualism is just the Western rationalist version of speaking to the dead.
Yeah.
So it's not a new idea by any means. But what happened was the story is very controversial and mythical, and I just hosted a historian named Paul Gaunt from England, because I host a symposium every year in Lilydale, and he spent 2.5 hours explaining to everybody how the origin story is wrong, and he drew from primary sources. But basically, on record, the story goes that the house, the cottage they were in was haunted, and there was lots of noises happening, and it got to a fever pitch level, and the girls decided to knock back to these noises, and there was a response, and then a communication began. So it was this physical interaction, this audible contact, that was the spark. But Paul Gaunt tells the story differently, which is that the adults actually were knocking to the spirit, and the girls were not. But then they started to, and then the knocking phenomena would follow them, where they separated them and put them in different homes, and so this phenomena would follow them, and then they were knocking and communicating, and then their older sister got them together to present this to the public, and that was the event that really started the movement.
And all this, I know the original excuse me, contact that they had was supposedly with this homeless fellow who was buried underneath their house or something.
He was a traveling peddler, and supposedly the story goes 3 families prior who had lived in the house that they were in. The peddler came and disappeared. He came to sell goods and then was never seen again. And then the next family had ghost experiences with this peddler, and then the Fox family did as well. So he was supposedly buried in the basement, and they did, in 1848, they did find hair and some bones, but not a lot. Like, they found evidence of a human body, but not a lot of it. And then in 1904, they took down a false wall, and supposedly they found most of a skeleton and a peddler's trunk. Paul Gaunt believes this is a hoax, but many other historians do not. They believe it was not planted, that they really did find a skeleton and a peddler's box. So it just depends. All of spiritualism really needs to be reassessed, because for so long it was written out of histories, and it has been the independent historians who have kept the knowledge, or you taken it seriously. I mean, growing up, I never any textbook I ever studied from did not mention spiritualism, despite the fact that it was an enormously popular movement and it affected science, technology, art, entertainment. Every aspect of Western intellectual culture was touched by spiritualism, and the most famous intellectuals in the world were interested in it. Um, so yeah, it's hard to get facts in
Hmm.
spiritualism, just
Sure.
in general. Just in general.
And does physical mediumship play a big part in spiritualism, or is there lots of different sort of branches of it?
Well, nowadays, what is most common is what you would see in television shows like The Long Island Medium, where, it's a white, clean room. There's candles, there's tissue boxes. There's nothing scary. It's very healing. It's very pure. It's very open. It's very white. Um, and most of spiritualism is that, but they do have dark seances, and the debate is, some people believe we do not need dark seances. Anything that can happen in the dark can happen in the light.
Hmm.
But then others in spiritualism believe that the physical phenomena and the dark seances have been part of it since the beginning, and that the spirit world needs the darkness to start the process. If you're going to be honest about what you're doing, which is basically manifesting, bringing forth a spirit. And yeah, there's a lot of contention about the topic within spiritualism. Like, how do you move forward? Some people believe it's to keep up the tradition of the seance, and others believe that it should be completely abandoned. And it's also been all of the whole history of the seance is rampant with fraud and strangeness and scientists trying to measure phenomena and not being successful at doing so. And yeah, so it's a complicated topic.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, so, something that I've always wondered about is, does spiritualism sort of exist within a Christian cosmology, or is there any reference to any god or deity or anything like that, or is that just not a part of it at all?
Well, the only thing agreed upon in spiritualism is a list of like 9 tenets. It's belief in God, communication with the so-called dead is a fact, the powers of prophecy and healing, the golden rule. I mean, it's a very short list, and that's it. There's no dogma, there's no book. So they do, depends on the spiritualist, but they do draw on other traditions like Buddhism or Christianity. And in fact, like spiritualism was supposed to bring together science and philosophy and religion. So I have, one of my closest friends who is a spiritualist medium, she hates the churchy part. She thinks that is anti-spiritualist, and that comes from the Christian influence on spiritualism, is to have church services, because spiritualists were supposed to defy everything. Not only did they defy death and hell and the church, so why are we having these church services? But depends on the spiritualists. A lot of them, most spiritualists churches have services, and they consider themselves a church more so than a scientific discipline.
Hmm. Yeah, that's so interesting how that sort of falls in between all of that intersection of all those things. So, Lilydale is a completely spiritualist community. How, when you go there, how does that? I mean, can you? I'm sure there's many, many differences, but you mentioned that was very analog. Like, to what extent does that manifest?
It's the town is just very much like a time warp, and I mean that's because when it was built, like, I have a architect friend named Steve Bass, and he's done a lot of lectures for my symposium on why Lilydale is so unique. And part of it is because you could never construct it today because it's not up to building codes. I mean, it's really a relic. And as far as like a town kind of from the past. And funny things like you own the home, but you don't own the land underneath your own home. So it's hard to get a mortgage. It's hard to get a home improvement loan. A lot of times you have to pay cash for houses. So there's not a lot of uh, progress, funded progress. That's part of it. And also they're very slow to change things. It's very they're very careful about keeping the traditions alive there. So um, yeah, I mean, even they're just right now. I mean, I don't know because I haven't stayed in the hotel in a while, but it's usually like you get a handwritten hotel receipt and you know handwritten guest passes and um, just not a lot of tech. I mean, yeah, like there's no internet in the main buildings. It's hard to get internet there at all, really. It's way out there. Um,
So it's the whole community is kind of isolated.
yeah, I mean, in the homes they have Wi-Fi and everything, but it's a trek to get out there for sure. And once you get out there, it's even like a long 1 mile drive down along the lake before you even get to the gate. So it's very you have to want to get there to get there.
Sure. And I wonder if the communities around them are respectful. Do they, kind of let them be, or are they kind of seen as the left of center community? Or
Yeah, I mean, I think it's accepted. I think there's tons of ignorance about spiritualism, and I mean, even me myself, before I went there, I was like, how could these people be sane and still believe this? Like, I couldn't understand it. And yeah, so I think there's a lot of curiosity about it, but it's a very peaceful area, and as far as I know, there's no tension or they don't get discriminated against or anything like that.
good.
No.
So, okay, we know how you got into photography and know how you crossed paths with Lilydale. How did you, how did those two things intersect?
So I was working as a photojournalist and as a public relations photographer, and I wanted to find a project to do in my spare time. Like I've always wanted to do long-term work, like a big long-term documentary project. So I thought, oh, I'll go to Lilydale and I'll spend one summer in this quirky little place and meet interesting people who are totally different from me and try to kind of observe. I mean, the whole town is very charming and picturesque. And so, I thought I'd spend a couple weeks like making a simple short documentary photo story essay. That's what I just thought, I mean, just in my spare time, just to kind of entertain myself or to creatively experiment. Um, yeah, but that's not what happened.
And here you are. How many years later?
18 years, yes.
And did you come from a sort of a religious or a materialist background? Were you open to this stuff to begin with, or did you just kind of had your eyes opened by the experience?
Well, I was raised Catholic, and my uncle was a bishop in the church, and he would say, you can go to Lilydale and you can get readings, but you just can't believe that more than the church, or you can't leave the church for that. But basically, he would tell us that the Catholic Church believes everything that does not denounce. It doesn't not believe in anything spiritualism believes in. It's just you're supposed to go through the priest. Um, a lot of Catholics are drawn to spiritualism, and in fact, I can think of like 3 or 4 ex-nuns and priests who are mediums in Lilydale. So I don't, and I was raised Irish Catholic, so that form of Catholicism fits quite well with spiritualism in many ways. So, yeah, I mean, it wasn't anything that was that far out as in terms of like how I was raised religiously.
Well, that brings up an interesting point too when he said that you just got to go through the priest to have those sort of connections. In spiritualism, is there a hierarchy like that, or is it more like everybody has the same chance at having that direct interaction with the spirit?
No, there's not a hierarchy and there's not a text, and that's part of the reason it's such there's so much anti-structure, and it's so hard to pin down, and uh, why it's so fluid is, yeah, there's definitely very little structure to it. It's loosely organized, and Lily Dell is actually a miracle because communities like that don't normally stay together for so long. And my friend George Hansen wrote a book, great book, called The Trickster and the Paranormal, and he goes into this deeply. And until I read that book, I didn't really understand that aspect and why that it being a non-hierarchical religion, why that was and how that affected things. And um,
Yeah,
yeah.
I like that. I like that. So when whoever you approached with this idea that you had to go in and start shooting photographs, were people pretty open to it? Did they invite you into their houses, or did you kind of have to warm them up to you?
Oh yeah, I was very welcome. I think it was because I was local, so that helped. But also I was just genuinely curious, and I didn't. When I proposed my project, I said I don't know what I'm going to do with it. But here's my past work that I've had published, and I don't know what will happen. Maybe it'll be an article or something. At that point, I didn't propose them any kind of end goal, and they didn't really demand it. They were open and they allowed me a lot of, they're very patient with me, all the people that I met in Lilydale, and I'm quite thankful for that. They just very openly taught me about what they believed and what their lives were like and what they did, and not very proud of it. They're at least the spiritualists that I have met in Lilydale are quite proud of the tradition of spiritualism and the life that they live accordingly. And yeah, so it was I was welcome for sure.
Nice, nice. Uh, and so then it came to the point where you sat down or sat in on your first séance, and how was that? I mean, were you trepidatious going in, or were you very just, well, we'll see what happens? What kind of a state of mind did you go into it with?
Well, I mean, I went in I was actually very excited because I had never been to something like that before, and I had no idea what was going to happen. And I didn't expect any paranormal phenomena, really. I don't know if I knew what to expect, but it was very exciting to be allowed to sit into a seance with my camera. But I soon found out that seances are really hard to photograph, and the pictures I was making were not corresponding to the psychological reality of the event. So that's when I started to get very experimental and use time exposures, or I had a lot of happy accidents happen with my camera. And I started to kind of embrace that and go with it. And then eventually, it took me about, I would say, two years to figure out a way of working that felt correct. But that way of working was considered very unprofessional.
Yeah,
Um,
because
yeah.
you started sort of utilizing what other professional photographers would probably call anomalies, right? You kind of started almost setting up circumstances where those things were allowed to happen and even were a part of the process, right?
Yes. And I mean, I guess it depends. I mean, all photography, certain styles of photography embrace it. So I guess I'm more correct when I say like the commercial photography does not. You know, in when you're trained to be a photographer, you're trained to take a hold of the medium and, you know, train it like a dog. Like it's going to work for you and you're going to know exactly what's going to happen and it's going to behave in the way that you want it, and you pre-visualize and you shut chance out as much as possible in order to be a professional commercial type photographer who can say to a client, oh, you need this, I can give you that in this situation. Absolutely. So that's what I mean by that. Like it's kind of like the opposite approach, by not controlling it and like letting it do what it's, you know, just bowing to the automation of it.
Which is kind of the vibe of a seance anyway, I would imagine. Like you don't ever know exactly what's going to take place. So I like that
Right.
element that you invited that element in. I think that probably served to your advantage.
Mm-hmm.
And I really love the ambiguity of this project because, as you said, it's sort of part photojournalism, part ethnography, and part like artistic interpretation. I love that it incorporates all those things.
Thank you. Yeah, it took a while to get there. And I'm kind of astounded that there is a lot more interest in spiritualism right now. Absolutely. And when I first started, there was not at all. I mean, people would not even, sometimes I would bring out my portfolio at professional situations and they'd be completely horrified. Like, why would you even bring this in and show us? I mean, people are a lot more open to it now.
Yeah, I'm
And
sure.
yeah.
What do you think that has to do with the psychic shows that you were talking about, or just the general,
I think
you know?
it's the times. I
Yeah.
think it's the instability. I think it's the all of that stuff.
Hmm.
And
Yeah, I think that maybe some of it has to do with the fact that science is sort of starting to make a full circle. Like around the time maybe that spiritualism was taking off, like science was more open-minded to that kind of stuff. It was more a part of the scientific worldview. And then as time went on and the decades passed, it became more reductionist and more materialist. But now it seems like it's sort of circling back around to the possibilities of things that, science would have scoffed at 25 years ago.
yeah, I mean, maybe. And, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. There's not a lot of scientists studying it anymore,
Sure, sure.
but
But what you did mention somebody that you later on when you started traveling to other countries to work on this project, Kai from Germany.
mhm.
He's been put under the microscope a lot. And what has come of that? And what were your experiences with Kai?
Well, Kai's a very interesting person, and he used to open freely himself to scientific study, and now he's less interested in that. And there's also, I guess I would say, if I'm going to speak as Kai, which I think, I know him pretty well, as far as, we've worked together for a while and we've had a lot of conversations that where I think he would just say, what does it do for mediums? It doesn't, it never helps mediums. There's no positive for me to go under those studies. So I'm not going to do it anymore. And so that's where he's at like a very different place right now. And he's just interested in the seance dynamic and building communities and having people have the experience of a seance and focusing on that and the after effects of that rather than proving things to somebody who wants to study. But he did, for a long time, he was going along with, some major studies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like doing a strip search beforehand and then being constantly under somebody's eye the whole time and then searched afterwards. Yeah, he was actually the guest on the first episode of this podcast. He was really fascinating to speak with. And spiritualism and physical mediumship, and I guess maybe all sorts of mediumship, there's always been this tension sort of between the real and the fake, and even questions as to if it's even a combination of those two things. What sorts of, as far as that's concerned, what sorts of things did you come in contact with? I mean, did you feel sometimes like there was some sort of fakery happening, for lack of a better term, or did it even matter because the experience was so powerful?
Well, I mean, I've had so many experiences that they really, I always say this, but they really do run the gamut. And yeah, sometimes you'll see a medium who really convinces you that they are speaking with the dead, like sincerely, so much so that you're shaken to your physicality gets completely shook by the experience. And then you could see that same medium a year later give the world's worst message to somebody. And, you could see somebody do a seance and go, oh my God, how can anybody believe that this person is doing actual or is invoking actual phenomena, because it's obviously such trickery. But then the person sitting next to you will have a completely different experience and write about it and talk about it and articulate it in the complete opposite way as you would. So it's a very slippery, ambiguous stuff.
Sure. Yeah, and probably the more you try and corner it, the more evasive it is. Like it doesn't lend itself to being pinpointed very easily.
Yeah, I mean, there's some people who think that that's part of the way the supernatural hides itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I would say that I would be more aligned to that type of thinking.
Absolutely. What if there is a turning point? What would have been the point where you were in a seance situation, or maybe not in a seance situation, where you felt like, holy shit, there's something really happening here. Like there's something profound going on. Was there a point when?
Well, I mean, this would probably be the closest to that. But the first medium I ever photographed was a woman named Gretchen Clark, and she's a 5th generation spiritualist. And she was giving a reading, and she let me sit in, and with my camera, which was super, beyond gracious of her. And she stopped the reading, and at one point her brother popped in to tell her a joke, and then she had this like little fight with her brother, and then she got back on track, and she was like, Shannon, Margaret's here. And I was like, oh, I don't know Margaret. And she closed her eyes, and then she opened them up, and she said, she says Texas. What does Texas mean? And I felt immediately ill, because I realized that my great aunt Margaret had recently died, and she lived in Texas. And then she said, oh, there's a picture of her that everybody says looks like you. And it's in the house. And she starts describing this photo. And it was true that my Aunt Margaret used to wear these cat eye glasses with rhinestones, and I had a pair just like them, and everybody would call me Aunt Margaret. And so I mean, it's just very weird, but my physical reaction was visceral. It wasn't my rational reaction. It was my physical reaction to it was very strong.
Yeah, I can imagine that would be pretty riveting. And then you mentioned also something having to do with somebody's hand changing shape during a seance that was really powerful for you.
Yeah, that was quite a long time later, but it's a person, a medium named Gordon Garforth, and his wife Gaynor, who are like the sweetest, nicest people in the world. And when I first met them, they seemed so normal and just like regular, nice older couple. And Gordon looked at me and said, "Well, and I go into trance, and then the spirits use ectoplasm to change the shape of my face and hands." And I was thinking, oh, okay, well, I'm probably not going to see that, but I'm still going to go to your seance and bring my camera. And so I sat in the front row, and then, 20 minutes in, Gordon's in trance, and Gaynor says the spirits are going to work with his hands right now. And then he just pulled out his hand in front of his body, and it was all in red light. So it was dim and red, but I could fully see it was very, actually kind of bright. And he moved his hand across his body, and it just like skipped into this gigantic form. And I screamed because and you're really not supposed to do that. It's like the worst thing you could do, because you can pull somebody out of a trance when
Yeah,
you do
yeah,
that.
exactly.
But then everybody else started screaming too, and I was like, "Oh, they're screaming because I'm screaming, or did they see this hand?" And then I was convinced that I hypnotically rendered the hand, and that when I saw my pictures, there would be like a regular hand, but there wasn't. It was a gigantic hand, and it was different than it was the same but different. Like, it wasn't the exact document of the experience. It actually looked much more stranger and grotesque in the photo, whereas like in real life it just looked like a gigantic regular hand.
Hmm. Wow.
I mean, it looked almost like you had like, as if it was like a just been pumped up. Like, I don't know, it's just
Strange.
very bizarre, very bizarre.
And it just happened, the change of size just happened within an instant?
Hmm.
Wow. That would be pretty mind-blowing.
And then they see the picture, like my friend Ron Nagy, who's the Lily Dale historian, is like, "Oh, Shannon, that's a glove." And I said, "Ron, it's not a glove. It's not a glove. It wasn't a glove." He's like, "Yes, it was." And it does sort of look like a glove, I guess. It looks strange. Like, it does not look like regular flesh in the photo, but in my reality, like my visual of it, it looked like a natural, just gigantic hand. Um, so yeah, that was pretty strange. Um, yeah, I had some of the weirdest experiences I had with my camera were with Gordon and Gaynor. So they're like a big part of my work.
And that was when they're from England, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
when your project sort of started going more international.
Yeah, I had to go to England because I don't know, spiritualism is more alive over there. There's a lot more going on. Not like there's tons, but I think there's like 800 spiritualist churches in England,
Wow.
which England is the size of New York State. So,
Yeah, yeah.
um, I don't know if that number is right. I will have to check, but there's a lot more than here. And there's the Arthur Findlay College, which is the spiritualist Hogwarts, and yeah, so I had to go to England. And also there was the skull experiment, which happened in the 90s in England, which reignited interest in using technology to talk to spirits. And a lot of that stuff was still out there in England, where in America it just kind of died out. Like I mean, to be fair though, it didn't. It still exists in America in the form of the afterlife community. You know, people who are, they refer to themselves not as spiritualists, but as like afterlife researchers are interested in the afterlife, and they have conferences and thousands of people shows up to those. But a spiritualist conference would be quite small in the United States.
I wonder why that is. But when we're
Uh,
huge, it seems like just statistically there would be more than that. It's odd.
well, it's just, people abandoned it because it was not able to prove itself through science, but it didn't go away. Now it's just the afterlife thing where people are doing mediumship and all of that. I actually, um, I'm going to out myself as biased here, but I think the people in the afterlife community have a lot to learn from the spiritualists. But for some reason, they think they're doing something new and more unique and more modern. Um, but I don't agree with that. I think they're doing the same thing, but just without the tradition. And like, for example, in spiritualism, if you're a medium, you would go through development, and there's, you know, suggested protocols and such. And it sounds ridiculous to many to say, oh, you can study mediumship or you can do it. But spiritualists believe that you can, and anybody can become a medium, and that there's ways to develop your gift, and there's boundaries you need to set for yourself and ways of working that are positive and keep you healthy. And like all of that doesn't translate when you just like reinvent it. I mean, like there's a lack of dialogue between those communities, and I don't understand why. And I think it's negative that the afterlife community and the spiritualists don't have more of an interaction. But
Yeah, it lacks a greater context, sort of.
yeah.
Yeah, it's more like some free floating philosophy and a bunch of ideas, as opposed to a lineage and a practice and a sort of like you said, a tradition. Yeah,
Hmm.
that's interesting. I like you mentioned technology, and within the spiritualist community, there are varying levels of technology that they're comfortable with. Could you maybe explain what those extremes are, like from the old school to the people who sort of do an updated version of it today?
Well, one of the main things, if you're in, so in America, that's the main organization is the National Spiritualist Association of Churches. And if you're in England, it's the Spiritualist National Union. But both organizations they only promote speaking with spirits of the dead. So you can't talk to aliens or angels or entities of other sorts. And if you are in, for example, let's say a seance situation, and it's in a church, an NSAC church, and you start talking as an alien or start channeling other beings, they'll shut it right down. Like they'll pull you right out. And that is, there's a lot of, because a lot of mediums have had UFO experiences or alien contact, or they describe such experiences. And it's basically to protect, because spiritualism is all about, they say they hate the term protection, but they have all these mechanisms to protect the medium. And I think that's one, because not everybody, I had one medium that I interviewed, and she said, oh yes, when I channel the ETs when I'm in trance, and their power is 100 times more stronger than spirits. And then my other medium friend, who's like from a different country, speaks a different language, was like, she's totally right. That's totally true.
Hmm.
So, yeah, it's very interesting to be at a place like Arthur Findlay College and see people from Japan and Norway and Italy and all over the world come together and have conversations about their trance mechanisms and how they work that level of consciousness, and be like completely in sync with each other and not missing a beat, and having a real genuine exchange about a technical process that is happening in their mind. And I mean, that's hard, I mean, you could say a lot about it, but for me, when I observe that, it's compelling stuff when you
Yeah,
see stuff like that happen.
absolutely. And that having a school surrounding that, it seems like that would lend some sort of credibility to it. Like it's something that can be taught, and somebody can go away from that school having learned techniques that work, like, and can be replicated. It's so weird that there's such a blind spot with science that doesn't want to confront that.
Well, I think maybe now there's a lot of consciousness studies, right? And I mean, all of that ties in, but indirectly, and also like placebo studies tie in. Um, but it's not. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. And this shamans some shamans in some cultures do sort of the same things too, as far as getting into an altered state of mind and going to different places or inviting spirits in to talk. But a lot of them use, medicinal plants or ecstatic dance or something like that. But there's nothing like that in spiritualism in this sense, right? It's pretty much very calm and everybody stays seated and
Yes, it's very Victorian in that way. That's what I
uh-huh.
always say. But yeah, no, it's a mechanism you learn to control. My friend Lauren Thibodeau, the medium, who she's my good friend who lives in Lilydale, and she calls it controlled disassociation. So, and I mean, a lot of mediums are brought through trauma. So it's like a mechanism that is, it's a safety mechanism that they come into contact with out of necessity, and that they then learn how to use or control or engage with. Unfortunately, it's true. A lot of mediums come from trauma.
Sure, sure. Yeah, I mean the same goes with shamanism and other cultures too. It's often not a fun thing to be, to serve the shamanic role in the community. Usually you're the outcast and you're kind of the go-between in between the material and the spiritual worlds. But there doesn't seem to be that sort of baggage with spiritualism, or spiritualists, I should say.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, but mediums don't get along. So there's that.
Infighting?
Yes, yes.
Interesting.
George Hansen taught me a term called paradrama, and it's a great term, and it's real. But yeah, like, so when you're saying the shaman was the outcast, that's true. And well, there was superstition about like, oh, you can't have two shamans in the same area. That means one of them's going to die, or, like, or they have to have these power wars. Who's more powerful, or who's the better. And I see that a lot with mediums too. So that's why it's so strange that, all the mediums live together in Lilydale, but there's a lot of small town stuff going on there, and paradrama and all of it.
Well, just out of curiosity, how small is it? What is the population?
I think it's 400 people in the summer
Mm-hmm.
who
Oh.
live there,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe 150 who live there year round. So it's small.
Interesting.
Yeah, I don't know how many registered mediums. There's probably, see, in Lilydale, in order to like sell a reading, you have to be a registered medium, but there's a lot of mediums who live in Lilydale who aren't registered mediums. And if they give a reading, they might, do it off the grounds, or use a phone line or something. So, and then some people are healers and not mediums, or, I mean, healing is a big part of spiritualism as well. And they do a laying on of hands that's inspired by mesmerism, and it's similar to Reiki. and that's a big part of it. Like most everything in spiritualism, the real intention behind it is healing. So that's what I try to explain, people, because spiritualists get very upset with terms like occult or witch or pagan or magic or stuff like that. They get immediately defensive because they're not trying to change reality or they're not invoking a spirit to do something for them. They're not instead they're bringing forth communication just to demonstrate that death is not the end, and then to create healing by making that link. So they're never going to ask. I had some person ask me, like, do you know a necromancer? And I was like, no, I don't. And she's like, I thought you hung out at that town. And I'm like, well, they're not necromancers. They're mediums. And there's a difference. Like, a necromancer would ask a spirit of the dead to do something for them in life. They would be invoking them through ritual to, for a magical result. And spiritualism does not do that. It's even wrong to you can't say to a spiritualist, for example, I need to talk to my deceased mother. They don't do that. They open up their consciousness, and whoever comes in. They don't go to them. You're not supposed to do that. And they'll tell you straight out, I don't know who's going to come, and I can't control that. I just open myself up to whoever comes in. And yeah, you can't do it the opposite way. That's frowned upon in spiritualism. So it's a very much like it is a very different practice in those ways. And, I think there should be more dialogue between, like, I meet a lot of young witches who are really interested in spiritualism. And then, the older spiritualists are like, we're not witches. They're like adamant against being put in a box with them. But I think there's a lot of interesting overlap, and that those communities could benefit from each other. But
do they have any sort of belief in reincarnation?
There's a joke that says, I forget who told me, but I didn't make this up, but I think it's hilarious, that reincarnation in spiritualism is like birth control in Catholicism. You're not supposed to believe it, or, you're not supposed to use it, but everybody does, or believe in it, but everybody does. And that's the difference between spiritualism and spiritism, which is when spiritualism went to France, and Allan Kardec, a French intellectual, decided spiritualism needed a text. And so he wrote a text and renamed it Spiritism. He wanted to make it more of a philosophy. And one of the major tenets of Spiritism is that reincarnation exists. So, but a lot of it depends on the spiritualists. Like, some believe in reincarnation, some don't. My friend who lives in Lilydale, he's a medical doctor, but also a medium, named Neil Zepkowski. He has this story about how he was giving a message and from a grandfather, and then the grandfather said that yes, he was reincarnated as the nephew, and then Neil said, well, how can it be talking to you if you're reincarnated? And I forget how he explained it, but he's like, I just learned to say, okay, well, all right, I guess that happens. So yeah, it just depends on the medium, really. Anybody in spiritualism, it's a mixed bag about, you could meet 10 spiritualists and they'd have 10 different definitions of ectoplasm, or 10 different definitions of what spiritualism is or should be, or what they believe. So yeah, it's very fluid.
And I'm trying to remain cognizant of time, and I feel like there's so much that we haven't touched upon, namely the book that you're getting ready to release this coming November, and ectoplasm being part of the subtitle there, we haven't even gotten into ectoplasm. So briefly, what is ectoplasm and what sort of role does it play in spiritualism?
So ectoplasm it's a physical substance that is believed to be both spiritual and material. And so it's, I first heard the term from the movie Ghostbusters. And I think that's where most people first heard that term. And what I found out was that Dan Aykroyd is from a spiritualist family, and when he's using that term, he's drawing it directly from his family's religion. But that's how it became into popular culture, is through Dan Aykroyd and using it in Ghostbusters. But it's a phantom flesh. It's a form. It's somebody described it. Paul Gaunt described it to me as like, well, ectoplasm is like water. It can take many forms. Like water can be ice or vapor, or like just a glass of water. So ectoplasm is this malleable substance that comes from the medium's body, and it allows spirits to take form or take physical shape, or to kind of present themselves in the material world. And that's what ectoplasm is.
And it can take different forms, right? Like it can form appendages, or I've heard about even lights appearing inside of it, faces.
Yes, ectoplasm is a mixed bag, for sure. For
What is
definite.
Now I've asked Kai what it's like to excrete ectoplasm. What was it for you to be like? What was it like to be in a room where that is taking place, where ectoplasm is coming out of this medium right in front of you? And
I don't know.
Documenting it.
It depends on the medium.
Yeah,
like
sure.
everyone is different, and everybody does different things, and defines it differently. And you even have like the skull experiment say, we don't use ectoplasm, we use energy-based mediumship. And I've talked to Kai about that, and he said, it's all the same. Like I don't really agree with Robin Foy, who's one of the main figures in the skull was skull group. I disagree with Robin on that. I think what he's talking about is just a different form of ectoplasm. So yeah, I don't know. Ectoplasm would be like you could do a 10-part series on ectoplasm. Sure. I mean, it's never ending. This weirdness of ectoplasm is never ending.
Maybe we should have a separate ectoplasm show to go along with this sometime at a later date.
Yes. Once the book is out, because then that's the visuals would be there.
Mm-hmm.
And I wax poetic about ectoplasm.
Have you written haikus about ectoplasm?
I've thought a lot about ectoplasm.
Yeah, I can imagine. I'm totally fascinated by the concept and the reality of that too. I hope to be able to sit in on a séance where that is happening sometime.
Yeah, I mean, that's another thing. When I started, there's sort of a renaissance happening. And I mean, when I say renaissance, I'm saying small, but in 2001, when I began my project, you could not find anybody who was publicly saying that they could produce an ectoplasm seance, or that nobody was doing that. It was underground. I mean, people were doing it in their homes and stuff, but it was very, I guess in the 90s, late 90s, Robin Foy from the Skull Experiment started the Noah's Ark Society to kind of try to resurrect the practice. And there was stuff they were going on publicly. Yeah. So I guess in the 90s there were, but not in America. And also too, like stuff was so obscure at the time. But now, it's more common. There's more interest in it. I mean, to be honest, there's a lot more interest in it now than when I first started. When I first started, they're like, oh, we don't do that anymore. And, it's backwards, and, spiritualism doesn't need it. But now there's like a lot more interest in bringing it back.
Good. I think we should remain open-minded to that sort of stuff. to anything, really. But yeah, especially to things that have been practiced for a long time and then kind of went into obscurity and then are surfacing again, thanks to people like Kai, right?
Yes.
Yeah. That's fantastic. So this book, very briefly, as we're almost on an hour right now, what you said, 17 years in the making, basically?
18.
18 years. And I bet it will show. What I've seen of it on your website looks amazing. The photographs look incredible. I can't wait to get my own copy of the book. What is it? Well, just tell people how to get it. How can they get a hold of it?
Well, it's published by Fulgur Press, which is a art press in the UK. But it will be distributed by DAP in the United States, so you can get it wherever books are sold. And it will be out probably a little bit before Halloween. I know the release says November, but I think it will be available before then. So
nice. When do you get to hold your own copy in your hands?
I don't know. Shortly, hopefully.
Oh, I bet that's going to be a good day.
It's being printed in Italy.
Fantastic.
And it's 300 pages.
Wow. Amazing.
And there's some never before published historical images that were graciously loaned by the curator Andreas Fischer, and Tony Orsler, the artist, wrote a really incredible essay, and he fully illustrated his essay with pieces from his phenomenal collection. So there's that too.
Cool. And you got Dan Aykroyd to write the foreword to it.
Yes.
That's incredible. How did that happen?
I randomly enough, so we had a mutual, his wife and I have a mutual acquaintance, and I have a friend who is very good friends with somebody who's very good friends with his wife. And and they happened to be in Lilydale when I was there. They they were there. And so
nice.
It just was very random.
Yeah, that's great. That's incredible, especially since he's credited with bringing ectoplasm into the mainstream, at least the word.
Yeah, I had been writing about that for quite a while, so it was like really incredible to be able to meet him and also like send him the work and have him do the foreword, and he's just been so really, really, really great.
Fantastic. Well, I look forward to the book. I'm sure the world does too, and maybe we can talk later in the year after it comes out and see what bombastic effect it's had on everybody that gets their hands on it.
Yes, I hope so. So,
yeah.
So to be continued.
Yes, absolutely. And where can people find you online if they want to look more into what you're up to?
My website, shannontaggart.com. I do have a mailing list you can sign up for. The site is it's in a transition period until the book comes out, but everything should be, after Labor Day, things should be really set.
Well, thanks so much for taking time out to talk.
Yes, thank you.
I enjoyed it, and let us do it sometime in the near future.
Thank you. That would be great.
All right. Well, have a good evening, Shannon.
And you too.
Yeah, we'll talk later.
Thank you. Bye.
That was a really fun interview. I know I say something to that effect after every one, but it's only because they all are. I arrange to talk to these people in the first place because I'm fascinated by their work or what they're doing with their lives or the experiences that they've had. So obviously I'm going to enjoy the conversations, and this one did not disappoint. I've been trying to arrange this, I think, since October of last year. So it's been a long time coming, and it was totally worth it. I've been fascinated by spirit photography since I saw my first photo book of it, probably when I was in middle school, when I was pouring through the metaphysical section of my library, both school library and public library. And I was always very fascinated by them, although many of them looked staged. But as you heard in the interview, that is a contention. That's something that is always on the parameters of this sort of stuff. And even people who purposely mix tricks with real. So, yeah, it's very, very elusive stuff. But the photography is very compelling, especially Shannon's stuff, because it has none of that staged look whatsoever, although it does harken back to those old prints. This, that you can tell, even if you can't exactly see what's going on, literally in the photograph, you can tell something intense is happening. So I highly suggest that you check it out. And you can find out, again, more about her work and where to find her book, which is coming out in just a couple of months. So around Halloween. It says November, but she said probably more around Halloween time. So that would be a perfect time to acquire such a book. All right. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that you continue to listen. I have promised a website, and it's very, very close right now, I've been told by the person that's assembling it for me. And I can't wait. I can't wait to have a real place where all of these episodes can live, instead of in the mire that is YouTube. But, it's what we have right now. So please, if you can, share and spread word on your favorite social media info harvesting site of choice, and it would be greatly appreciated. Or if you care to subscribe to a monthly fee that can be as low as $1, you can go to www.patreon.com/themeltpodcast. And anything that you could donate would be very, very much appreciated. I'm trying to expand the operations here. I would like to actually go to conventions and go out in the world, spend a night in the haunted house, all sorts of stuff, and be able to afford to do that and bring those experiences back to you. So any way that you can help in that regard would be greatly appreciated, and that includes just spreading the word, just sharing it. So thank you so much for listening. I've got a lot of great episodes coming up and planned. Stay tuned, and I will, as soon as there is a website live and ready to go, you will be the first ones to know. All right, until next time, take care.